ordinance.
Well, fast forwarding again.
So more about Convention 83.
Coming back again to 83.
Excuse me, though, when you were talking about the black and white caucuses the first time, that was in the convention in 82, is that
Yes,
correct?
that was the first time they were
DC.
held. There were no black and white caucuses at the very first convention. In 82 was the first time they were held. They've been a tradition pretty much since then. In 83, we did again have them. I can't recall what the controversy there was, but I assure you there was one. And I'll talk about the 85 one, Black Caucus, momentarily. But at the convention of 83, we were confirmed for a final year. But we were going to be lame ducks from January on because the new co-chairs would then be elected. And so we began a transition process for them to hand over, and for me in particular, to hand over the reins to the next co-chair, because for the existence of the IA, I had been the co-chair for essentially 2 terms. And that process, Jerry and I sort of beginning to get everything in order and set up some structures and some memoranda and some procedures for the functioning of the organization occupied us thereafter. And we continued doing the kinds of things that we had been doing externally and internally. Chapter support being significant in that regard, going and visiting chapters, trying to help chapters get going and get off the ground, and also trying to the extent that we could to give useful and helpful advice when chapters would turn to us for advice. But as we began to transition out, the next team was elected. There was a lot of discussion at the 83 convention about the new electoral process and what that process should be. And that, I think, was when we sort of agreed on a much more complicated mechanism to ensure regional representation as well as racial parity. The editorial board had ceased to function, and the responsibility for that was transferred to committees within the National Association structure. It essentially ceased to function because it's very, very difficult, and it's never been a good thing to write by committee. And it was just too difficult to circulate and get approval with a board of 4 that was deliberately and mandatorily located all over the country to approve our newsletters and to approve interim communications. So I had done a couple of newsletters unilaterally, just by myself. And I remember finishing them up. And Tom Horan of the San Francisco chapter, who would one day become an NA co-chair, came into LA, and he and I ran them off, and he just literally mailed them out to individuals and chapters that were involved as members of the International Association. So the editorial board, as an independently elected body, ceased to exist at that time and was transferred. And there were some other changes that were made in our functioning, but basically we were pretty much going forward at that point. And that's pretty much what happened. The next co-chairs that were elected were Greg Leonard of Atlanta and Billy Jones of Washington, D.C. And that proved to be a very interesting chapter in the International Association's evolution because both of them left the International Association prior to the terminations of their terms under somewhat negative circumstances. And I think it's a tribute to the momentum that had been built up that the International Association nonetheless survived those crises and continued to function and did not fall apart despite the loss of the 2 subsequent co-chairs that succeeded Jerry Mallon and myself.
They were elected at the convention in 83 to serve a term beginning in January of 84, is that correct?
No, I don't think that they were elected in 83. I think that they were elected, it seems to me that they were elected by mail. A new mechanism for election was created and approved in Columbus in Columbus '83. But the actual election itself took place some months later. And I think that Greg Leonard and Billy Jones did run on a slate following us, and again, despite some opposition, and were elected. But there came some crisis, personal crises. There were personal crises for each of them. They were not crises of DNA, and the organization survived.
Yeah, so your term as co-chair ended pretty much January of '84,
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. I went out of office, Jerry went out of office, and I took a hiatus from Black White Men Together. I resumed some activity locally, but I took a hiatus from the International Association entirely. I did not go to the Atlanta convention, though I'd heard that it was wonderful. And I remained in an advisory capacity to Billy Jones and Greg for as long as they were in office, and worked closely with them. And the transition was smooth and was amicable, and I worked with them and I supported both of them in succeeding us. But I sort of returned to my private life and also to the local chapter here in Los Angeles. And I didn't get involved again until, what you mentioned, the convention of '85.
Mm-hmm.
That was the convention that the BWTLA chapter had agreed to host. It was the first time it was hosted in LA, and I think some people had actually wondered why none had been hosted here before. I mean, because we were certainly one of the largest chapters. Mm-hmm. But we took it on in '85, and I became program chair, responsible for the content of that convention, along with my committee co-chair, Gibson, and we worked long and hard on that, and we were determined to kind of bring in some new things to that convention. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we did was we set up a series of debates, I think 6 debates, and we brought on various racial, political, lesbian and gay issues. And we brought in people who were associated with one side or another of the debate, and got them to participate in these mm-hmm. debates. One of them I remember that received quite a bit of local gay media coverage was whether or not the bathhouses should be shut down. Remember, this was June of 1985, mm-hmm. and at that time that was still the baths were still regarded as one of the havens that we had created mm-hmm. In an oppressive socio-political environment in this country, and they were still being staunchly defended by activists. Yet at the same time, the HIV epidemic was beginning to take its toll in some pretty clear ways. At that time, there were neither treatments nor were there tests mm-hmm. available for mm-hmm. HIV.
Just death.
Yeah. Pretty much. So it was a difficult time, and we staged that debate and several others. We also brought in some speakers. We brought in the mayor of Los Angeles, the president of Los Angeles City Council. We brought in Troy Perry, Reverend Troy Perry, who was the head of what was the largest gay organization in the world, MCC, and several other speakers.
Bayard Rustin.
We brought Bayard Rustin from New York, who had been in an interracial relationship for years, and who, of course, had organized the original March on Washington in the early '60s, and then not been allowed to actually serve as the chair or come forward publicly because of his known homosexuality. Mm-hmm. And he came in and was our keynote speaker. So we brought some dynamic speakers in. We organized a set of debates. We did what was at that time the radical thing of soliciting condoms from the county health department of LA and distributing them at the convention. And we tried to create opportunities and workshops that were really interesting and really kind of dynamic. And we did a lot of public relations, of trying to recruit people to come, trying to get people to come from areas that had not been recruited before. Up until then, the convention had not been promoted very strenuously. We put a lot of effort into promoting the convention. And of course, there were the famous black and white caucuses. And the Black Caucus this year, the controversy that year was that in the hotel in which we held the convention, which was near the airport in Los Angeles, that the Atlanta chapter, which had hosted an enormously successful convention the previous year, held a reception in one of the rooms and in the hotel, and to sort of advertise and promote their reception, and as a joke, they went up and down the halls of the floor and put up Confederate flags. And this became known as the Confederate flag controversy of black and white men together. A number of members of the organization took exception to that, and some were deeply offended. And several members of the New York chapter were very vocal about that. Several members of the Atlanta chapter became very defensive about it, and it became quite a cataclysm. The following morning, the respective black and white caucuses were held, and that incident was immediately brought up in the Black Caucus as the issue which tore us asunder. And I remember that Lydell from New York wept, he started crying, and that led several others to start crying. And I remember James Creedle from the New York chapter speaking in a voice of such power and passion that I felt literally knocked back up against the wall and pained by the power and the passion of his voice and the earnestness with which he spoke and expressed his outrage and sense of violation and fundamental inability to comprehend how anyone could take that symbol and make a joke of it, bring it into the safe space of an organization like Black and White Men Together. And from after he spoke, a number of members rose to speak in voices that I had never heard them speak in before about what it meant to them to be black and to be living in an America which had the kind of history of race relations it did. And others spoke just as movingly, just as persuasively, just as powerfully, arguing that it was time to let go of that pain, and that it was time for us to no longer give power to those symbols, to hurt us, or to determine how we would behave toward one another or toward anyone else, that it was time to move on. And those two forces collided in that room with such force that it took all the air out of the room. It took all of your energy to stay, and it took all of your energy to get up and move. And nearly every brother in the room spoke on the issue, and a number went out weeping. I remember Steve Durrell, who was the planner and the director of the overall convention, who was white, and was standing outside of our door, and he was just sort of trying to make sure that logistically everything was okay. And at one point, I stepped out of the room. I just couldn't breathe. And Steve said, "Charles, what is going on in there? Guys are coming out of there crying and weeping and speaking incoherently. And what can we do?" And I said, "Nothing. It's just got to run its course." And I went back in, and guys were still testifying on either side and on all sides and coming from all kinds of places. And there was such a sense of injury and such a sense of division in that room that many members began to speak of their feeling that this was a moment of no going back for black and white men together, for some of them, that they could not see continuing to try to dialogue and work with other black men with whom they disagreed so profoundly on an issue of this kind. And John Bush, God bless him, God bless John Bush, he rose in the middle of this consternation and pain, and he circled the room, and he began to speak, and he began to sing, and he began to come to each of us and ask us to give our pain to him, and our feelings and our anger, because there was as much anger as anything in that room. And he took it from us and made a ball of it and compressed it and took it out of us and said, nonetheless, it's ours, and we have to take power over it. And he had us join hands around that ball of anger and pain and close in on it until it was gone. I've never seen or experienced anything like it in my life. It was magnificent, and it convinced me for the first time, really in my gut, that we have something special to offer, and have been places I've never allowed myself to know about, because I don't know where that kind of power came from that day. But it was enough to destroy relationships that have been built up over years, and brotherhoods and bonds. And yet it didn't. We were able to master them. And John, who is an academic committed to the scientific method, wove a spell of goodwill among us and pulled it out of us from someplace that no academia has ever seen or ever been to. And that was Convention 1985.
Thank you, Charles. I would be very interested to know the ways in which you feel gratitude towards the organization. If there are ways in which you feel that you would say thank you to the IA or the NA, are there ways that you feel you have benefited that you would not have benefited had you had no association with this organization?
I don't think I'd be the man that I am today. The portions of the man that I am that I admire and like and am comfortable with were it not for black and white men together, both locally and nationally. Not only did I acquire skills, but I learned to care about something greater than and outside of myself, and to give to something until it hurt, and until I was able to see that giving becoming something good and strong and useful. But above all, what BWT gave me was a sense of camaraderie with other black men. I think until BWT, I was a stranger to my own. And there are a lot of things that BWT taught me and gave me, including a career in politics, but nothing so meaningful and so consoling as the relationships it gave me to some wonderful white guys, but above all, to some beautiful, beautiful black men. Mm-hmm. This is Charles Stewart, and we are conducting an interview this evening the 19th of June, 1999 in Los Angeles on BW&T Hill at the home of Colin Gibson, and we're interviewing Colin Gibson. And we're interviewing Colin about his memories and activities within the National Association of Black and White Men Together, of which he has been the treasurer in years past, as well as having been a co-chair of Black and White Men Together Los Angeles, and currently the newsletter editor, once again, of Black and White Men Together Los Angeles. Colin, how do you remember hearing about the National Association of Black and White Men Together?
Well, that really goes back to my college days at American University in Washington, D.C. And I had at the time a friend and fellow runner, Bernard Mercer, who, with his lover, Roger Collier, was involved in the D.C. chapter. And the D.C. chapter at that time was in the habit of hosting zodiac birthday parties for all persons born under a given sign. And both Roger and Bernard were Pisceans. So I was invited to a Pisces birthday party at their home, and felt I had died and gone to heaven. I didn't know there were so many hot men in all of D.C., still less so many that were interracially interested.
Aha, this is March 1982?
No, this would have to have been in the later part of 1981, because I didn't move to Los Angeles until November of 1981, so I already had some exposure to BWMT while I was in D.C.
I see.
They also had a wonderful luau on Capitol Hill.
Ah, and so from that initial exposure, what came of it? What happened next?
Well, what happened next is that I moved to Los Angeles, and this was the early years of the Ronald Reagan presidency, and Reagan had come to Washington saying that he was going to slash government, and indeed he did pair the roles of the federal civil service to some extent. And all of these displaced federal workers were competing for jobs with recent college graduates, of which I was one in 1981. So my job prospects not being all that they might be in D.C. at the time, I was looking somewhat further afield for a job, and was ultimately offered a writing position in Los Angeles. And so having to relocate, the chapter became the nucleus of a group of friends and a sort of social matrix for me. It was Roger, Bernard's lover, who made that happen initially for me, and I don't know whether you remember it, but you are one of the very first people that I got to know in Los Angeles, sort of on Roger's introduction, direct or indirect.
I recall Roger was the representative of BW&T Washington, D.C. at the very first BW&T convention in San Francisco in 1981.
And he subsequently was a founder of the Baltimore chapter.
Aha, I see. And so you came by the connection in Los Angeles, having first connected with a BW&T member and BW&T chapter in Washington, D.C., and connected with us here in Los Angeles. What then led to your involvement in the National Association of Black and White Men Together?
Well, I first became involved, well, I attended a little bit of the Washington Convention in 1982, but due to circumstances over which I had no control, I was late. So I missed Adrienne Rich's speech, or at least I missed her delivery of that speech, which I would have really looked forward to hearing. I already knew of Ms. Rich through her poetry, and the speech itself, of which I now have a copy, is poetic, and I would have loved to hear her deliver it, but alas, that was not to be. My first full convention was in Columbus in 1983, and I guess you might say I was involved in the NA just by virtue of having attended the convention and made some contacts. My actual service to the NA, I guess, began in 1985 when I first served on the convention program committee with you, and then was subsequently elected treasurer at that convention.
Had you gone to that convention anticipating that you would be elected treasurer?
No, I believe that was something that came up in the course of nominations during the convention. I had already served as local treasurer, so I had some experience to go into it with.
And as I recall, you were at some point, either before or subsequent to that, involved handling some of the accounts for the AIDS Prevention Task Force that BWMTLA launched initially with Phil Wilson. Have I got that right?
I think you're probably fast forwarding to the Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Forum, which, if my memory serves, was founded in 1988.
Ah, okay. All right. I do remember that while some of the things were going on in the National Association, you were very much involved here in Los Angeles with BWMT Los Angeles, holding office as, I know, newsletter editor, and at some point as co-chair of the local chapter as well. When were you co-chair?
1983 through 84.
I see.
But we do need to go back, and what we need to go back to is something that I think that you're familiar with. There was a time when Warren Timoney and Don Nelson were elected chairs of the LA chapter, and I believe it was Warren's idea that he was going to ask for the resignations of all sitting committee chairs just so that he could clean house and have his pick of who was going to be involved in his administration. It was always Warren's intent, as he expressed it to me, that he wanted, to have the absolute right to either accept someone's resignation or to decline it. But this message didn't really get out to Tom Hain, who was then serving as the newsletter editor, and I'd become involved on Tom's committee helping him get the newsletter out. So when Tom was asked to resign, and we took it quite literally, and he was deeply offended. And while I believe he subsequently came to understand that Warren had meant to get rid of some other folk and not him, I basically found myself newsletter editor because I was, first of all, working in journalism at the time and had some time on my hands, and having this vacancy created by Tom's literal resignation.
When was it that you came to live on what we affectionately call BWMT Hill?
That was actually in June of 1982. I had been living in a real pigsty of an apartment on Normandy, and I had a lover at the time, Harry Henry. And Harry had seen the hill, and he was living in the pigsty, not too happily. And it was reported to us that William Manning, who had been the social chair of BWMT Los Angeles when I first came, was leaving the hill, number 1349, rather suddenly. And Harry's reaction was, well, you have to go see Ruetti and find out if the apartment is for rent. And I said, well, he's bound to have a waiting list. And Harry said to me, I didn't ask you what you thought. I told you to go ask him. So I did.
Ruetti Brack then being the owner, having inherited
from Betty Hansen.
From the previous owner, the 2 or 3 apartment buildings in the Silver Lake Elysian Field. What area are we in exactly?
Elysian Park.
Elysian Park area, where so many BWMT leaders, by chance or by design, came to live at one point or another. So you took up residence here in 1982.
Yes.
Okay. And you served as co-chair. Were you involved in some of the local programs of anti-racist activity and political activity, as well as being newsletter editor at that time?
Well, I was involved in the investigations, as I believe you were, that led up to the adoption of the City of West Hollywood's anti-carding ordinance. This was modeled on an ordinance that had already been adopted in Atlanta under the direction, I believe, of Bob Doyle of the Atlanta chapter, and he had furnished us with the text of their ordinance, which we'd then adapted to the local conditions of the new city of West Hollywood. And I remember that one rather striking innovation, as it was put forward in West Hollywood, is that there shall be no discrimination against people wearing clothing not associated with their biological gender.
Indeed. And in that ordinance, I think in some ways that might have been one of the early examples of interchapter cooperation that led to a tangible benefit in terms of combating racism locally. We got we got wind of the idea from Atlanta and didn't reinvent the wheel. Asked them to send us their ordinance. They did.
Well, then the investigation we did was modeled, I believe, on an investigation done by the New York chapter in connection with the Ice Palace. They had a long brewing controversy over discrimination at the Ice Palace, and I believe they closed the bar.
That's right. I recall that as well. And we sort of staged sting operations here locally.
With Ann Curry, who was then with Channel 2.
Right, and of course who's now a national reporter with the Today Show. And let's come forward to the National Association, and you went to the Columbus Convention, and then at the Los Angeles Convention, you were elected treasurer.
I was. And in those days, I remember the question was asked of you, why the decision to rename the association as national rather than international. Originally, that had to do with funding. It had to do with the fact that there were a number of funding agencies out there that would fund national projects in the United States, but were not broad enough in their mission to fund an international association of anything. So it was decided as a matter of expediency, and I believe it was Jerry Mallon who first brought this to our attention, to become a national association, even though we did have some offshore affiliates, in order to take advantage of grant funding.
Well, and you had been involved in the local chapter in incorporating BWTLA. Was that considered in terms of the National Association? I mean, what kind of an organization, a legal entity, did the National Association become?
Well, the National Association became, and I have no information that it ever became something else subsequently, a New York corporation, because Mitchell Karp had drawn the incorporation papers, and in order to become a nonprofit charity in New York, you need the express approval of the Attorney General.
Mitchell Karp then being an attorney based in New York City.
Right, and this was long before I became an attorney, but I was still somewhat practicing law as a legal secretary at the time, but let's not go there. Anyway, I had, in my law office context, become familiar with the process of seeking 501c3 tax exemption. The 501c3 refers to a section of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code by which tax-deductible public charities are known. And originally, the attorney who incorporated the Los Angeles chapter, and I was not that person, but that was Al Gordon, had sought 501c3 tax exemption on behalf of the LA chapter. One of the things you do when you apply for a 501c3 is you submit copies of your literature, your newsletters, your brochures, as whatever you may have, to show what kind of a program you're operating. Back in 1981 and 1982, our social events were billed as just that, social events, and the IRS got one look at this and they said, no, you are a 501c7 social organization and you do not get tax deductibility. Well, having committed to the course, we wanted to be a 501c3, and I took over just as that was becoming a problem, and I responded on behalf of the chapter to a number of IRS inquiries. But ultimately, the status was not to be had, and we had the alternative of litigating over it. And in fact, Jim Mercer and his lover, whose name escapes me right now, were tax attorneys and competent to litigate this, but you know.
And members of Black and White Men Together Washington, D.C.
But even they, you know, wanted some compensation for the work that would go into litigating this issue. And after the chapter really counted the cost, we said, no, either we cannot, or even assuming we could, we will not pay for that litigation. And so we became a 501c4 civic organization, you know, not tax deductible, but maybe a little bit more respectable.
I see, but that experience dealing with the IRS, did that serve you in any particular good stead once you became NA treasurer?
Oh yes, we avoided the mistakes, and to a large extent the NA never suffered from the same problem, although there are, of course, social events at our conventions. There is enough program going on that I think even the IRS had to see that as an educational function we were serving.
I see. So when you became NA treasurer, in what state did you find our books? What did BWMT National look like?
It looked small, but the books themselves were in the very tidy condition one might expect from Jerry Mellon.
Subsequent to serving as NA co-chair, he ran for and became treasurer of the National Association, correct?
Right, and I believe he served concurrently with John Bush, and the two of them together had enough academic experience applying for grants that Jerry, and I think John too, had submitted, for instance, grant applications to the Liberty Hill Foundation, and we were funded in certain small amounts. Now, I'm sure Liberty Hill was much more interested in programs like the Resisting Racism Action Guide than they were in funding, you know, the ongoing infrastructure of the organization. And in fact, that was an issue that continued to be very important through my term as treasurer. I remember submitting a final report at, I think it was the New York Convention.
In 1996.
Because actually I've been reminded that that's 1986. That's a problem we get into. But anyway, my final report at the New York Convention in 1986 basically said the organization had a choice. We could focus inwards on chapter development and the needs of our constituency, or we could focus outwards on, you know, for want of a better word, evangelizing, you know, outside the organization on issues of racism and homophobia. And it was only if we elected to pursue the latter course that we really had any business applying for grant funding for what we were doing.
And how was that recommendation received in the national organization?
With a deafening silence. No answer came the stern reply, as my father often says.
I see. And so what course did the organization take by default?
Well, by default, I think we have become less and less dependent upon grant funding, with the exception of that period, which now seems brief in retrospect, but it was very important at the time, when the NA launched the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention and received at least $300,000 from the Centers for Disease Control to do AIDS prevention in Black and other minority communities. But as...
Do you remember what year that was?
No, I have to admit I don't. But I do remember that long before Reggie Williams retired and moved to Amsterdam, the task force had been spun off as a separate 501c3 organization in order to, in effect, get free of interference from the NABWMT board. It was perceived at that time that the demands of the board members for information or control or whatever it was that they were asking Reggie for was unreasonably hampering the task force's ability to do its job. One thing that's kind of unfortunate is although the kind of oversight the board wanted to provide may or may not have been the right thing, some kind of oversight was needed, based upon the fact that after Reggie, the task force went into a hole in a big hurry.
Well, nonetheless, there was a period of years when the AIDS prevention team and task forces sort of were perceived, at least at the NA level, as the tail wagging the dog, were they not?
Well, sure, because it was much bigger. In my time, and I think perhaps since the task force, the NA budget has been in 5 figures, and while the task force was a part of us, it was 6 figures.
I see.
Mid 6 figures. So, we're doing okay for a while.
What were some of the issues that the NA tackled during your period of term as treasurer, and how did you perceive them from a physical point of view?
Well, the resisting racism was always a part of the NA's mission, and I believe by that time the mission was perceived a bit more narrowly in terms of publishing and assisting chapters rather than direct national action such as you spoke of in your interview. So I think it was down to a fairly manageable level, but somewhat amorphous.
And did you ever consider yourself running for NA co-chair?
Yes, and at the time when I was most electable, I don't think I was experienced enough to take the job. Now, I think I'm experienced enough to take the job, but the organization is no longer in sync with me.
How so?
How so? Well, we have, I think, largely abandoned the premise of our founder that an interracial organization, an organization by and for people who are first of all conscious of race, and secondly want to date, or marry, or sleep with, or have sex with someone else of another race. That whole idea has gone by the wayside. Our chapters no longer believe, or some of our chapters no longer believe that race exists. Now, whether race exists or not may be kind of a metaphysical question, but for us, it can never be a metaphysical question because it's part of the foundation of who we are. And once we lose that foundation, we're in the paradoxical place of having sawed off the very branch we were sitting on.
Well, given that premise of black and white men together, what sort of advocacy do you think was and is appropriate?
Well, I think in your day, because there were not as many black gay organizations to do it, it was okay for you to say, phone up or write Ginny Apuzzo and say, hey, there's some black gays and lesbians out here that you should be paying attention to. That role is no longer ours. Now there is the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum that can call Ginny Apuzzo or her successors themselves. What I think is appropriate for us is to articulate, first of all, that it is okay to have a sexual preference in which race forms a part, but also to